Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Let's get started. Paige Thacker is with us today. Welcome to our Wednesday. Please mute yourself, except Paige, and turn off your video so that we can save bandwidth. This will be about an hour program, but we'll save some time at the end for questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box and we'll answer it if we can, or refer it to Paige at the very end. Paige Thacker is a horticulture agent, but she's also our unit coordinator of the Virginia Cooperative Extension Prince William unit. She has her bachelor's and master's from Virginia Tech, and she's a great source of knowledge about many horticultural topics, plant IPM, and integrated pest management in particular. So thanks for being with us, Paige.
Sure. Glad to be here. So we're going to talk about plant problems, mainly some disease problems, and then IPM, which sort of summarizes how to control problems in the garden, not only disease, but insect and any pest in general, so weeds as well. So we'll want to get started. Thanks for joining us. I think I have way too many windows. Oh, wait, way too many windows open. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about right plant, right place, and making the plants happy so we don't have problems. And then we'll talk a little bit about telling the difference between the causes of problems that we see, and then some examples that we see in the landscape, and then some management strategies to wrap up the end. So the concept of right plant, right place is huge in landscapes, and many of us inherited landscapes that may have some problems. So when we talk about meeting a healthy landscape, a sustainable landscape, we want to reinforce the right plant, right place concept. Making sure that we evaluate in our landscape the soil types. We all have, in this area, many of us have clay or a mix of clay and loam, what the pH is. Our pH in Prince William is anywhere from 4.5 to 5.5. So growing plants that like that pH and those soil types are important. Sun exposure, do we have, many of us have lots of different exposures in our yards, full shade, full sun, etc. Moisture levels, especially in these rainy years where we have excessive moisture, that can complicate the success of our landscapes. Hardiness zone, we're in Hardiness Zone 7B or 7A, depending on where you are in the county. And so making sure that we're actually buying plants that are hardy here is key, because some of those retailers will sneak in plants that are marginally hardy and try and sell them or make you think that they are hardy. And then making sure you have space to grow the plants that you select. We don't want our the cute little plant that we end up buying to eat the front of our house, to eat the landscape, and then we have to prune it, which causes stress on the plant to make it fit for the small sites that we have. And that is a common problem that we see in landscapes throughout the area. And so making sure that it's sized right, and then choose plants that are suited for that growing space, depending on what that is. So we always want to try and consider growing or incorporating native plants into our landscapes, because those are the ones that perform the best in Prince William County. And they're the ones that the native wildlife that we have, native or non-native wildlife that we have and want in our landscapes prefer. And then anytime we have plants that are suffering from any environmental stresses, whether caused by us or caused by a hot summer or a really wet winter or wet summer, those are going to be especially susceptible to pest pressure. So it's important to to understand these concepts as we go in and evaluate our landscapes. So some questions that we discuss for diagnosis. It may seem like we're when you come to us or when we have a plant problem, talking with friends or clients. These are some of the questions that we would ask, and it seems like a CSI experiment. And but really, these are important things that help us kind of establish a pattern, so we can help with plant problems. So making sure you know the plant and the plant families, what's normal, the common problems associated with those plants and plant families. When did you see it? What part of the plant is affected? How old is the plant? How are they mulched? How are they planted? Do you fertilize? Do you water? Have you ever seen any pests before? And then have you used any pesticides or around these plants that may be causes for some of the problems that we see as well? When we have a problem, timing of the symptoms help us figure out, that it provides clues to help us figure out the cause. So, and unfortunately, if you're not in tune with your landscape or the plants in your landscape, everything may happen suddenly. But when we monitor and walk around our landscapes, even now when it's a little cold out, get out there, walk around, see what's normal, see what's going on with your plants. And that sudden onset of problems, of symptoms, indicates an abiotic cause, so environmental cause. A gradual onset or spread of symptoms where it may start on a couple leaves or a couple stems and then could gradually increase across the plant is generally a biotic cause. So fungal problems, insect problems, and that sort of thing. So that helps us determine, again, more clues to help us figure out what's going on. So we're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of abiotic problems that we see. Again, they can be tricky to diagnose because there could be many factors complicating what we see. Again, knowing what's normal, knowing that plants might have speckles or spores on the back of the leaves, or a number of different characteristics that are common is important. Keeping that garden journal or on the calendar, those past weather conditions, is really valuable, especially at the beginning and the ends of the season. How much rain we've had, how much rain we haven't had. All of those are great things to keep track of on a calendar or in a journal. And then knowledge of past cultural practices. What's been done, you may know that up to, if you're new to a home, you may know that up to a point, and then you may not know after that. But generally, those cultural practices that we're doing in the landscape commonly help us figure out or contribute to those abiotic causes. So here's some examples of fluctuations, extremes, or lack of water and temperature. So the the picture with all the water beads on the leaf, that's called gutation, and that's commonly seen in the mornings when the plant has taken up so much water that it's almost gushing water. So that's and it could be temperature caused as well. Colder temperatures, so it didn't need to utilize all of the water that it took up. And then the picture below, obviously a lack of water, so our plants are wilted. And sometimes, even though the soil may have been watered after that, sometimes plants just don't recover. Here are a couple other pictures of extremes. The maple leaf on the one side, I'm not sure if it's your right or your left, how you're seeing it, it's on my right, with the edges all brown. That is an extreme of temperature and lack of water. So that's generally we see those symptoms in the summer. And then the picture in the center is, again, lack of water where the, it could be just not enough, or it could be too much and it's too wet, causing the leaves to turn. So again, those are some abiotic causes we see. Mechanical damage, we see that often through pruning. The picture in the top center is a very large branch that was pruned off, and the plant is trying to seal itself again. Sometimes those large pruning cuts can cause other problems, and in the center, that heartwood can get diseases or insects in as that plant's trying to seal, and can cause the overall health of the tree to decline in the long term. Pruning at the wrong time can also cause problems, or just pruning in general. Those, for example, the viburnums that are down here, down on the left, have been pruned into oddly shaped, very unnatural shrubs, and those cuts made over time, year after year, the plant is going to become stressed, and while it's done very commonly to reduce shrub size, overall, it's not going to help the longevity of the plant over time, because every time you make a cut, you get multiple sprouts coming from that. Pruning actually stimulates growth, and so again, it stresses the plant out, and it's having a natural form, and going back to the concept of right plant, right place is so important for plant health. This is a picture of boxwood, another example of pruned in July, or probably August or September. It may not have time to harden off, and so the tips that you see that have turned sort of a straw color just didn't have time to harden off, and so the winter got them, and they may end up dying and causing additional fungal problems as a result. So cold damage is another abiotic problem that we see. We haven't had too many extremes, but generally in some years, I believe this might be a maple, I'm sorry, a magnolia. And so sometimes those evergreens, broadleaf evergreens, continue to take up moisture. And if there's not enough moisture in the winter, you'll see this desiccation along the edges. And sometimes we don't see that damage until April or May. So again, even though we're seeing it in April and May, not during the cold temperatures or the dry conditions, sometimes knowing the details of the seasons previous will help us figure out what the issues are. This is an example of a yew that sprouted out in spring and the temperatures were too cold. Sometimes that happens. We get those cold snaps, those late frosts in April and May. You know, our last frost date is April 20th, but we still can get cold snaps that cause that new delicate tissue to die back. And so this is an example of that. This is an example of rhododendrons and what they do when it's cold as well. And you might not have damage. Again, knowing what's normal is important. So you may not see problems overall throughout the growing season. So another common abiotic problem that we see is due to fertilizers or pesticides or de-icers. So these are examples of, this is probably a herbicide or chemical damage on turf grass. This is chemical damage on oregano that was in a landscape where they treated the grass but got the ornamental plants on the edge of the garden. This is potentially caused by de-icers, and so it caused damage to, I believe that might be boxwood in the picture. Potentially de-icer damage, and then this is herbicide damage on the edge of a sidewalk. Could be de-icer as well. Again, asking those questions, what have you done? Did you apply chemicals? Did you apply de-icers? Will help us kind of narrow the spectrum on what the cause could be. One of the other problems that we see that's a common problem in the landscape, and people come to us and say, what's wrong with my tree? And they're 15 years old, but the plants may have been planted too deeply and mulched too heavily. So again, it's one of the main problems we have in Northern Virginia. It's almost like job security for the green industry. They're planted too poorly. You want to make sure that when you plant a tree, or when a tree or shrub is planted, that you get those flares, those roots right at the soil line. Above is probably better than too low. And you want to make sure that transition zone stays above the soil, and those root flares are right at the soil line. I'm sure you've seen many mulch volcanoes, and maybe you'll have a special eye for that now after seeing this. If you don't catch it already, it's everywhere. This over mulching is a problem, and what we see is that those roots will grow up into those mulch volcanoes, and then we have a dry spell, and that they're the first ones to die. And so stress on the trees and the landscape is very common. What we should have done in the case of the mulch volcano that's pictured here on the left is spread that mulch out and not even have grass in that parking lot island to allow for that tree to be as healthy as possible and those roots to grow out as far as they can. Currently, they're probably all up in that mulch volcano and not out in the soil. So spreading out instead of up is really important. For the picture on the right, this plant was planted too deep. Being able to see those root flares, that natural widening of the trunk as it turns into roots is important. We see that a lot in forests and natural situations, but not in our landscape. And so digging into that mulch yielded that plant was, or the tree was planted probably 6, 8, maybe even more inches too deep. And again, we're not going to see those problems in the landscape until, the tree is 15, 20 years old. And you can see issues with the plant dying from the top or certain branches dying as a result. Okay, so we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about biotic disorders. And so those living factors could be pests such as insects, mites, rodents, rabbits, people, and then pathogens. We'll talk about fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. So our fungi are the most common plant pathogen that we see in the landscape. Some spores are ubiquitous. They just need the conditions to be optimal for them to grow and spread. And we'll talk about identifying those conditions shortly. Plants can be infected when the fungi use enzymes to penetrate that plant cell or enter through the stomata or on the underside of the leaves. Fungi are very adaptable, and they produce survival structures that allow them to go undetected and overwinter in our landscapes without us really knowing. And then those spores can be spread by wind, splashing water, animals, people, on tools. And so it's really important for us to understand how they grow to be able to manage them. When we talk about bacteria, those are single-celled organisms. They're not as common, but we do have a couple that cause problems in our landscape. Fire blight in orchards is one of them. Those are localized spots that can be oily or greasy or water soaked, or they could have an odor to them. And then bacteria spread systemically through the phloem and the xylem. So they have great ability to move and spread through the vascular tissue. Viruses are common as well. We do see them in the landscape. They're not as numerous. There are probably 2 or 3 that we see most commonly in the landscape, and then in vegetable gardens. And the nematodes is a sort of a root worm, so to speak, that gets in the roots of plants. Again, we'll talk more about fungi and bacteria symptoms and signs than some of the others. But if you have questions, certainly Extension can help you figure that out to identify what the problem is. So when we talk about diseases of ornamentals, whether it's landscape plants or vegetable plants, the damage depends on what's affected. Those environmental conditions that have existed during that plant's growing season, and then the plant health. Again, those stressed plants are going to be more susceptible to problems. These diseases can be really costly, or they can be tolerated, and that's up to you, the gardener, to determine if it's something that you want to live with. It's important to know the plants that you have in the landscape, so we can help you identify those plants or give you some resources on where to continue to identify your plants. But sometimes those diseases are very specific to the plants that you have. For example, the rose family ranges from roses to some ornamentals like Cotoneaster, Pyracantha, but also in the rose family are our fruit trees. And that family is extremely susceptible to a lot of fungal and bacterial problems. So again, knowing the plants that you're dealing with is really important. So if you can take home one concept on managing diseases, I hope that you remember this. It's really important to understand the conditions that allow disease to grow. We talked about having plant parts affected, those environmental conditions, and then a susceptible host. So we have the presence of a fungal organism, for example, the pathogen. And again, it could be just a couple spores, or it could be a large amount of spores that have accumulated over time. We have a susceptible host, so a plant that's not really the right plant for the right place. And then we have those favorable environmental conditions. And depending on the pathogen that we have, it could be cool seasons, conditions, it could be wet springs, or it could be warmer temperatures, temperatures in the 70s and 80s, those warmer temperatures where plants stay wet. And the longer that you have a susceptible host and a pathogen and those favorable environmental conditions, the more chance you have for disease to develop. So understanding that it's sort of the perfect storm of those 3 or actually 4 conditions, when we talk about managing plant diseases in the landscape, it's really important to know that we've got to manipulate at least one of those factors. So if I had a fungal problem on a vegetable plant, for example, I may remove some of the pathogen if I can see it. And that removing the pathogen makes it less susceptible, or less, there's less less pathogen to spread. If I can control the environmental conditions, if I can limit the moisture that comes in, reduce my frequency of watering, for example, sometimes that may help. If you're in a situation where you have root rots, for example. Or just making the plant happier. Fertilizing the plant could be making the plant happier, or not fertilizing the plant as much. So again, knowing what the plant needs will help us figure out how to manipulate those diseases. So when we talk about some of the fungal problems that we do see, we talk about signs and symptoms. And so a symptom is that abnormal condition showing that the disease is present, and a sign is the actual disease that you can see. So we'll look at some examples. The symptoms could be spots, blights, galls, cankers, rots, but it's actually the manifestation of the disease on the plant. What happens? You might get cells to die. You might get stems to start showing some cankers, like the picture on the bottom. You might see growths as a result of that. That's a symptom. That's actually possibly an insect gall, but it's still a symptom. These are galls on cherry, I believe. This is a canker on a bean root. Cankers kind of interrupt those flow of vascular systems, the xylem and the phloem. And then wilts. And then these are signs of diseases. So the top one is powdery mildew, which actually is the vegetative portion of powdery mildew that grows on the tops of the leaves. Many of you may have seen that. The bottom picture is rust. So you might see orange or yellow spots on the top of the leaf. But if you were to flip that over, you would see dusty, powdery looking orange signs on the bottom, and that's rust. Bacterial ooze is another one that we see and smell at times. And then botrytis, any of those moldy spores. Botrytis is a real common decomposer in the landscape. So if plant leaves are left to, they turn brown, and then you get more conditions to allow it to grow, you'll see those spores. Kind of like when you leave bread out too long, you get those green or brown spores on it. So how do we solve these problems? Having a plan to figure out is important. And so we use IPM, or Integrated Pest Management, to help us solve those problems. So knowing the plant pest is really important in the integrated pest management. And sometimes you need help trying to figure out what the cause is. Treating a problem as maybe an insect problem when it might be a fungal problem could save time and effort and use of the wrong chemical or the wrong practices. So it's really important to identify the problem that you have. Is it biotic or abiotic as well? Once you've identified that pest, knowing the life cycle and habits. And generally, when we talk about controlling any of the pests that we may deal with, doing it early in the life cycle when whatever that pest is small and more susceptible is going to be the better control. Waiting till it's, we have adult insects or that are maybe chunkier and harder to control. Waiting till the disease is spread to multiple parts of a plant or multiple plants, that's when it's harder to control. Accurate assessment of the population is important. Is it one leaf? Is it one stem? Is it multiple plants in a row? So understanding how far and wide the problem is. Again, knowing those plants that are common in your landscape and those problems that they get. And when we talk about IPM, elimination of the pest to an acceptable level is our goal. We may not be able to obliterate it completely. Again, when we talk about fungal spores, they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. So it's just making sure that maybe the plant has more air circulation so those fungal spores can't grow. That's what we're looking for. So one solution might be to not do anything and just keep an eye on it. While the impatience of the gardener may be to hurry up and take care of it, it may not be the right time. or it may be that it's not completely harmful to the plant in the long run. Again, that's why identification of the problem is important. When we talk about planning a solution, making sure that we look at all methods, chemical and non-chemical, as a solution is really important. And we'll talk a little bit about those in the next few slides. Those long-term plans for prevention or suppression of those are going to be key. We want you to continue monitoring the plant and adjust that plan accordingly, and we're happy to work with you to do that. Pay attention to those environmental conditions, knowing if you have powdery mildew on a certain plant, watching for the temperatures that when powdery mildew is most commonly a problem, generally late summer where those night temperatures are very high and the humidity is high, that's when we see those problems develop. So again, know your enemy, know its habits, and then that will help you plan a solution to control it. So nature provides some natural controls that help us already, and believe it or not, we might have other problems if it weren't for some of these natural controls. So for example, climate, weather conditions, especially temperature, day length, humidity, and all of these that affect pest reproductivity and activity, rain, drought, freezing temperatures, adverse weather. Climate also influences growth and development of the host. Natural enemies like birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals that help keep pest populations in control. Pathogens often suppress populations as well. So again, you can have nature kind of helping you with that. Already there, you don't have to encourage it. Or maybe your landscape is already to where it's encouraging those natural enemies. Geographical barriers like mountains, large bodies of water restrict the spread of pests. There are certain pests that we don't have in the United States or in Virginia because of those geographic barriers. Food and water supply naturally can be affected and either help those pest populations thrive or not. And their life cycles will depend on water and removing the food source. The pests can die or become inactive. Available shelter can affect populations, some pest populations as well. Overwintering sites and places to hide from predators are important to the survival of some pests. So those are the natural controls that we're enjoying already. But then there's some applied controls that we can employ to help us, and we'll go over these real briefly. So host resistance, that's the ability of a plant or animal to resist an attack by a pest. That could be by natural development. So we think about, plants in the mint family have that host resistance because, to deer, for example, because deer don't like the taste of the minty plant. Hairs on the leaves or multiple hairs on the leaves can help make it unpalatable to be eaten or make it undesirable or make it so fungal spores can't develop on it as well. So one of the things that is that we do recommend is if you can choose resistant varieties, especially in the perennial or the vegetable garden situation, those resistant varieties to problems that we commonly see are going to help avoid those issues. I will say though, host resistance can only be to a point, and if there's enough pest pressure there, you may still have a disease problem, for example, or you might find that deer probably won't eat holly. It's not a preferred plant, but if there's a lot of holly there and they're really hungry and a lot of deer, then again, that IPM control might not be so helpful. Biological control, that's enhancing the environment, favoring the growth of a pest's natural enemies. So encouraging parasites, predators, and pathogens to help control those natural enemies, and creating habitats that favor those predators. For example, when we talk about insects, getting plants that in the composite family that attract some of those great wasps that control some of the pests that we see in our vegetable garden. That's a great example of biological control that we can employ in our garden situation. And then just making sure everyone knows that this is a picture of a ladybug. This is a immature ladybug. And then this is what they look like before they molt into the characteristic ladybug that we find. So if you see this, it's not a pest, it's actually a good guy. So again, knowing what's normal and knowing what you have is important, especially if we're considering chemicals. We'll talk about that in a second. So cultural controls, looking for other things that we can manipulate to affect those, maybe that disease triangle or the population. Looking at rotating crops, as seen in the center picture, thinning out plant materials so you have better air circulation, so you have less potential for disease to grow. The longer leaves stay wet, the more chance they have for disease to develop. And so being able to prune it out and allow for better air circulation is a great way to control a fungal problem. And then on the left, we have, you might want to increase your rows, not plant the plants so close together. And again, that might help with fungal problems, that might help with insect spread as well. So allowing more area for the plant to grow and have better air circulation is another cultural control. Other cultural controls we commonly recommend are, watering and fertilizing and how you're doing that, either not enough or too much. And so that's why we ask those questions again. Mechanical control, if you're growing squash and have problems with some of the squash bugs, mechanical controls are great. Doing that early, right after the plant is planted, helps control some of the squash bugs. And so we're altering that environment by introducing a physical barrier. And likewise, deer fencing is a great mechanical control. Oh, well, didn't know that was linked. Sorry about that. Clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, so then sanitation is one of the last IPM strategies, and that's when we prevent or suppress populations by removing pests, physically cutting off the plant material or cleaning up and removing the sources of food or shelter. So cleaning up any diseased or infested plants at the end of the season, it's not as important to clean all that up, and it's actually beneficial to some of the insects that we may want to foster in our landscape, as long as there's not any disease present. The plant on the right is a juniper, and it's densely growing, and so if we were to go in and prune out some of the dead brown growth on there, we're going to remove some of the fungal pathogen, we're going to remove some dead material, and we're going to increase air circulation. And in this situation, because it's so widespread, we might actually even follow up with a chemical application as well. And when you're cutting, using pruners in the garden, it's really important for you to clean your clippers. So another example of sanitation practices is disinfecting your clippers. If you cut into diseased material, especially, and not clean those clippers, the next cut you make into healthy material could actually spread that disease problem as well. So it's important to sometimes in between each cut clean your clippers, but definitely after a job is done, If there's so much spore there anyways, it may not matter, but after the job is done, before you go to another plant or put them away for the day, cleaning those clippers, oiling them down, drying them off is really important. So chemical controls is definitely part of integrated pest management, but it should be the last strategy that you consider. And so again, we can't stress enough identifying that problem so you can choose the correct pesticide if you need to. And we're so happy to help people come to those conclusions and formulate a strategy. So choose the best formulation. For the chemical is if you have a turf problem, sometimes granular is easier to apply as opposed to liquid. So formulations do make a difference. You want to use those pesticides when the target's most vulnerable, and hopefully you all are saying in your mind that's when it's small. Okay, you'll see that these repetitions are important. They're important concepts. Use pesticides at the labeled rate, and you're going to have to read that label hopefully more than once to make sure that that you understand the commitment that you're making by applying a pesticide. Wear personal protection. Make sure you don't you protect yourself as well. And then you want to direct those applications to the target, not to all the other plants around it. It's really important to not do broad treatments, but just specifically to the problem. So for an example, if we have a lot of weeds, in one area, you may apply to that large area where there's multiple weeds present, but in some cases, just actually applying to the weed that's present is important. So you don't over apply or introduce more pesticide than is necessary into the environment. Because they can be harmful to other non-target organisms. So wrapping up a little bit about pesticides, when we select a pesticide, it's important to look at that toxicity signal word, and that could be, that can help you pick the least toxic chemical, which I would think that we all want. So caution is the safest of the chemical spectrum. When there's a warning, generally it's probably a hazard to water or to fish, aquatic organisms potentially, or danger. So again, knowing those toxicity levels, the signal words, and then selecting one of the lower toxicity first. Is your first strategy. If you don't control it, you might want to step it up. But there are other things that we can introduce as well instead of just a pesticide. Keep in mind on the label, there's also precautionary statements like hazards to humans. So look for those on the label and again, select that correct personal protective equipment. If there are especially hazards to the skin, dermal exposure is one of the most common pesticide exposures that we see in pesticide applications. So making sure that you wear the minimum personal protective equipment, long sleeves, long pants, and gloves. If it has a high hazard to eye exposure, then you might want to wear goggles or a mask, or if it's the respiratory system. Or if swallowed. And a lot of times these exposures happen in the mixing and loading phase, not in the application. So you want to wear that protective equipment from start to finish and make sure that you're protected. Environmental hazards are also listed. Again, sometimes the chemical we select might vary for those environmental hazards. And so it's important to pay attention if there's hazards to water or runoff into local creeks and streams, wells. So something for us to consider. And then also air. We see a lot of complaints about drift from one landscape to the next, especially with herbicides. Another factor to consider when you select is reading those directions for use before you buy the chemical, and making sure you have the appropriate application equipment. So those directions for use on the label let you know how to apply it, and do you have the right equipment? Can you get good coverage on the upper sides and the undersides of the leaves? For example, if you're treating for bagworms on a leyland cypress, chances are they're 40, 50, 60 feet tall. And do you have the right application equipment to make that application yourself? So in some cases, it may be safer in the long run to contract with somebody who does have the right application equipment, and can apply it more safer than we can as homeowners. Modes of action are really important. Keep in mind there are a lot of pesticides out there that's still in the market that affect insects processes like nerve function, and that nerve function is something that occurs in people as well. So when you're introducing that chemical, and you're hoping to control an insect, you might actually be affecting yourself as well if applied improperly. So we recommend considering selecting chemicals that target different modes of action, like an insect's ability to molt and grow into the next phase of its life cycle, or growth habits. Not those people processes. That's really important. And then just a note about organic pesticides, keep in mind they're registered with the EPA as well. They are pesticides, even though they're from an organic origin. They're still registered pesticides, and they can still affect non-target organisms just as traditional pesticide would. Just because it's organic, the risk and potential hazards and toxicity still might be high. So this is why we want to read the label prior to purchasing the chemical. We also might want to employ other IPM solutions in tandem with that chemical application, which kind of segues to our last slide. So use pesticides as a last resort, and we may be able to clean up or cut out or cover, for example, employ those IPM strategies to help us control that pest. And you're going to use that pesticide when the target's most vulnerable, not when it's most important to you, or not when you see the problem. So it could be that you might have to wait till spring to control the problem when the pest is more vulnerable. Again, consider what factors you can manipulate to improve that plant health. A note about fungicides, they're preventive, not curative. So if you apply a fungicide, it's only going to stop those new symptoms from developing. It's not curative. It's not going to control the parts that are already affected. So again, monitoring is important before fungal problems get out of control. And then insecticides, it's really important to look at the difference between broad spectrum insecticides, especially if you have some of those really great biological helpers in our landscape, those predators and pathogens that we want. Because if you use an insecticide that's a broad spectrum, such as a permethrin based chemical, which are very common, you may end up killing the good guys as well as the bad guys. And those new technologies that affect those plant processes or certain plants, insect families, those new technologies are geared towards those certain plant families and those processes, and so they're safer for us to use. Some really great references. The Virginia Tech Pest Management Guide for 2021 is available. You do have to download it. You can't view it online anymore with the new Pest Management Guide or the new publication system that Virginia Tech has. You can always order a print copy, and I believe they might be $15 this year, but don't quote me on that. There is a fee for that print copy. Some resources, one that I came across that I encourage you guys, if you use pesticides and want to know more, this Grow Smart, Grow Safe link is tremendous, and you can search insecticides, fungicides, all sorts of chemicals out there and understand their toxicity and learn more about them. The National Pesticide Information Center is another great resource, and then Beyond Pesticides. So some really great online learning if you choose to go. And then who else can help? Well, the Extension Master Gardener Horticulture Help Desk is available. Email is probably better, as we're still, you can call and leave a message, but emails with photos are always appreciated. And when the office opens back up, you can consider bringing in a sample. Sorry for that. We want you to send us pictures of your samples, and we're happy to work with you. So use this contact information, the Master Gardener at pwcgov.org. You can always go on the Virginia Cooperative Extension website and then go to our local website, the pwcgov.org/grow for more information. And we're here as a resource for you. So I'll take any questions that you have now. Thank you.
I think we've answered most of the questions in the chat. There was one participant that asked about a good source for local weather data that would be an easy format to cut and copy and paste into a garden diary.
Yeah, there is for rainfall. There's I find it really hard to find rainfall data. And there are a couple individuals who are actually taking the rainfall data that they have. There's a farmer in Nokesville, and there's a homeowner in Gainesville that are doing that, and they're reporting it. And I'll make sure when the information is sent out, if there's information sent out, if you want to send us an email or send the help desk an email, I can give you that website. It's not even sure I have it bookmarked. One sec. Let me stop sharing, and I could go to that. I don't know if I can share. Would it be better to send you the link, Christina, and you share that?
Yes, if you could do that.
Okay, we'll do that.
That would be great. Thank you.
That way, for time consideration, I'm not futzing around trying to figure out how not to disconnect myself.
Paige, can you put up the page that you had with resources on it again?
Certainly.
Thank you.
I can also send that out when I send the link for the YouTube video and the evaluation.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There's one more question about, do we have a specific recommendation for powdery mildew control if the plant needs more help than just removing the leaves on it?
So one of the things, if we're talking about all the IPM strategies, if you see powdery mildew year after year, one of the things that is recommended is finding a way, if this is the case, to decrease the amount of shade that the plant is in, allowing those the leaves to dry more. So pruning, if this is possible, it may not always be, pruning other limbs around that might shade the plant to allow the disease to grow. Pruning the tree itself that gets the powdery mildew to allow for better air circulation within. And then there are sprays that you can do, but generally with those fungicide sprays, you would have to apply every 7 to 10 days, as long as that disease triangle, those conditions are conducive. And that could be, depending on the growing season, that could be July to September, July to October. Looking for, the other thing is, as leaves fall, cleaning up those leaves that have powdery mildew on them to reduce the presence of the pathogen as well. And if that doesn't answer your question, send us an email to the Master Gardener Help Desk and we can help you more one-on-one with the specific situation. Let's
see.
Are there any other questions?
There was one, I grew cucumber plants.
Got it, Christina.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Okay.
I don't see any other ones.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We hope to be a resource for you in the growing season should you have any plant problems. So thank you.
Okay, if that's it, we will be sending out an evaluation and the link to the recording probably by Friday. I will make sure I include all the resources that were in the chat and in the presentation for everyone. And there were several questions about spotted lanternflies. I will attach some documentation for that as well.
Yeah, thanks for being the eyes and ears for spotted lanternfly this growing season.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.